The sun, a molten coin, bled across the Montana sky, painting the Bar M's vast horizon in hues of orange and bruised purple. Garrett Holt stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, the rough-hewn wood cool beneath his calloused fingertips. In his other hand, a crisp sheet of paper rustled faintly in the evening breeze. The reply from the matrimonial agency. He'd done it. The thought settled in his gut like a cold, hard stone. He traced the etched lines of the distant mountains, the same peaks that had watched him grow from a gangly boy to a man hardened by the land and, more acutely, by betrayal. The air, usually thick with the scent of pine and sage, seemed to carry a ghost of another fragrance tonight. Vivian's lilac perfume, faint and mocking. A sharp pang, familiar and unwelcome, twisted in his chest. He remembered her, vibrant and laughing, her dark hair a wild tumble against the stark white of her wedding dress. Not his wedding dress. Never his. "You and I, Garrett," she'd whispered, her lips soft against his ear, the scent of wildflowers clinging to her. "We're meant to conquer this world together." He'd believed her. A fool, then, high on the intoxicating promise of forever and the heady scent of her skin. He'd been 20, she 18, both fiery and untamed, mirroring the rugged landscape around them. They'd ridden for hours, the wind whipping through their hair, their laughter echoing across the valleys. They'd planned their future under a canopy of stars, her hand clasped in his, her promises a sacred vow whispered into the vast silence. He'd worked himself to the bone, expanding his father's ranch, pouring every ounce of his ambition into building a future grand enough for her. He'd dreamed of her presiding over a bustling ranch house, children with her dark eyes and his stubborn chin running through the fields. He'd envisioned a life overflowing with laughter, shared dreams, and the quiet comfort of her presence beside him. Then came the letter. Not from her, but from a lawyer in Helena. A terse, formal document outlining the sale of her family's adjoining land, the land she had sworn would one day merge with his. She'd married another, a banker, older, wealthier, with connections that promised a life far removed from the dust and demanding rhythms of ranching. A life she'd secretly yearned for, even as she'd spun tales of devotion beneath the Montana sky. Garrett remembered the hollow ache, the way the world had tilted on its axis. The rage, cold and potent, had simmered beneath his skin for months, threatening to consume him. It still did, sometimes, when the memories clawed their way to the surface. He'd lost more than just a woman. He'd lost a piece of himself, his trust shattered into irreparable fragments. The Bar M, once a symbol of their shared future, became a monument to his solitude, a constant reminder of what he'd built alone, in spite of her. He clenched the mail-order bride letter, the stiff paper crinkling under his thumb. Clara West. The name felt foreign, detached. She was a means to an end, a pawn in a game only he understood. Vivian would hear. She always did. News traveled fast in this valley, and the arrival of a new woman at the Bar M, a wife no less, would undoubtedly reach her ears. Let it sting. Let her wonder what she'd thrown away. Let her see him not as the ruined man she'd left behind, but as a man who'd moved on, thrived even. He would prove her wrong. A gust of wind, smelling of approaching rain, rustled through the cottonwoods by the creek. The ranch was quiet,
The only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the mournful cry of a coyote. Solitude had been his constant companion for too long, a chosen penance.
He'd pushed away anyone who dared to get close, his bitterness a thorny hedge around his heart. He'd built walls so high even he struggled to see over them. But now a stranger was coming, a woman. He hadn't thought beyond the initial act of ordering her, the defiant gesture. What would she be like? Soft, pliable, easily intimidated? He needed someone who wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't stir the embers of his past. He needed someone to fill a vacant space, not a void in his heart. He stared down at the letter once more, the neat script outlining Clara West's arrival date. A woman from Ohio seeking a new life. He wondered if she had any idea what she was stepping into. He didn't care. His decision was made. He was taking back control, one calculated move at a time. The Bar M would have a mistress, a wife, and Vivian Holt, wherever she was, would finally understand the true cost of her betrayal. A shadow returns. The scent of pine and drying hay carried on the crisp autumn air enveloped Garrett as he stood on the porch. The matrimonial agency's letter, crumpled in his hand, held the smudged confirmation of Clara West's arrival, a woman he knew only by name and the agency's assurances. This new chapter, though born of practicality, felt like a deliberate blow against the past, a hammer stroke to silence the phantom of Vivian Thorne. A shimmer of movement at the property's distant edge caught his attention. A rider. He squinted into the morning sun, which glinted off something metallic. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That particular graceful equestrian posture was unmistakable. Vivian. The name soured in his mouth, a bitter echo of broken vows. He watched her approach, a familiar unease coiling in his gut. She rode with an inherent elegance, her dark habit a stark silhouette against the golden fields. Her gaze, even from this distance, seemed to rake over the Bar M, assessing, cataloging. He could almost feel her calculating mind at work, appraising the worth of his land, the integrity of his fences, the vitality of his herd. He remained rooted, a stoic figure on his own threshold, allowing her to close the distance. She dismounted with fluid ease, tethering her mare to the hitching post. Her eyes, the color of rich earth, met his. A practiced softness, a veneer of concern, shimmered there, a facade he knew to be gossamer thin. "Garrett," she purred, her voice a low, melodic murmur. I heard things weren't going well. I was worried." He offered a curt nod, his expression a fortress. "Things are fine, Vivian, as you can see." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, its structures solid, its corrals orderly. A fabrication, perhaps, but one he intended to forge into reality. She took a step closer, her gaze tracing the subtle lines of weariness etched around his eyes. "You look tired, Garrett. It's been so long since we truly spoke. I often wondered if you'd ever forgive me." Her small, delicate hand lifted, hovering for a moment, then dropped to her side. He felt the familiar gravitational pull, the almost magnetic charm that had once entrapped him. But this time, a new clarity sharpened his vision. This time, he saw the strings, the puppeteer behind the smile. "Forgive you for what, Vivian?"
For abandoning me for a wealthier man? For shattering a promise that held no weight for you? His voice was flat, devoid of the persistent ache beneath. He wouldn't grant her the satisfaction. Her eyes widened minutely, a feigned hurt flickering through them. Garrett, you know it wasn't like that. My family, they needed me.
I had obligations. It was the same threadbare excuse, a well-worn path of self-preservation. Obligations that apparently superseded any feelings you claimed to have for me, he retorted, a spark of dormant anger finally igniting. She sighed, a theatrical exhalation that barely stirred the air. You always were so dramatic, Garrett. But I see the ranch is still standing. You always did have a knack for getting back on your feet. She paused, her gaze sweeping the ranch once more, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. I suppose you'll find someone new, eventually. Settle down. This was it, the moment he'd anticipated. He allowed a slow, deliberate smile to spread across his face, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Funny you should mention that, Vivian. As a matter of fact, I already have. My fiancée, Clara, will be arriving within the week. Her usual composure, typically unshakable, wavered, a subtle stiffening in her shoulders, a fraction of a pause before she spoke. Your fiancé? That's sudden, Garrett. Her voice was a fraction sharper now, a discordant note in her usual smooth delivery. Is it? He challenged, savoring the slight crack in her facade. I'm a man of action, Vivian. When I decide something, I follow through. He watched her closely, searching for the telltale signs of her true feelings. A flicker of jealousy, perhaps? A hint of possessiveness? Jedediah, Garrett's foreman, emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused, his gaze assessing Vivian, then Garrett, a silent question in his eyes. Jed had always seen through Vivian's charm, always warned Garrett. Vivian caught Jed's eye and offered a tight, polite smile. Jedediah, still here, I see. Her tone carried a faint, dismissive edge. Jed merely grunted in response, a sound that spoke volumes. Well, Garrett, Vivian said, turning back to him, her smile now a brittle thing. I hope she makes you happy. I truly do. The words were delivered with a false sincerity that grated on Garrett's nerves. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that her visit was not about concern, but reconnaissance. And now she had new information to process, something to fuel her envy. The first volley had been fired. She untied her mare, her movements a little less fluid than before. I should go. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. I'm better than all right, Vivian, Garrett said, his voice firm, unwavering. I'm moving on. He watched her ride away, her shadow diminishing with the distance until she was gone. The Bar M, once again, was his alone. But the shadow, he knew, would inevitably return. And this time, he would be ready. The unexpected arrival. The dust cloud on the horizon grew steadily, morphing from a vague smudge into the distinct shape of a stagecoach. Garrett stood on the porch, the matrimonial agency letter still clutched in his hand, its edges worn from nervous handling. He'd barely had time to process Vivian's departure, her barbed words still echoing in the quiet air, before this new arrival demanded his attention. He straightened his shoulders, a practiced mask of composure settling on his face. This was it. Clara West, his mail-order bride. The stagecoach rumbled closer, pulling to a halt with a cloud of fine ochre dust that coated everything. Jedediah, ever efficient, was already moving towards the horses, his movements economical despite his years. The door creaked open, and a gloved hand emerged, followed by a woman's form. Garrett had envisioned a demure, perhaps even plain woman, someone eager to please, compliant. He was wholly unprepared for the vision that stepped down onto the Bar M's dusty ground. Clara West was not merely attractive, she was striking. Her traveling dress, though simple, clung to her slender frame with an understated elegance. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, was pulled back in a neat chignon, but a few rebellious tendrils framed a face of startling beauty. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, intelligent and piercing, taking in her surroundings with an almost preternatural calm. She wasn't looking at him with awe or shyness, but with an assessing gaze that made Garrett feel like he was the one being evaluated. A flicker of surprise, then something akin to irritation crossed his features. This wasn't the meek little mouse he'd imagined. Clara, ignoring Jedediah's offered hand, smoothed her skirt and walked towards the porch with an unhurried grace. Her gaze swept over the ranch house, the corrals, the vast expanse of land, before settling on Garrett. There was no flinching from the harsh glare of the western sun, no nervous fidgeting. She simply stood, poised and observant. "Mr. Holt, I presume?" Her voice was clear, low, and carried a subtle melody that hinted at education and refinement. It was not the high-pitched, anxious tone he had expected. Garrett, caught off guard, managed a curt nod. "Miss West, welcome to the Bar M." He extended a hand, feeling strangely awkward. Her grip was firm, brief, and cool. Her gaze, sharp as flint, drifted past him, lingering momentarily on the faint tire tracks leading away from the house, tracks that hadn't been there moments before. She also noticed the lingering scent of expensive perfume, a ghost of Vivian's presence that had yet to fully dissipate in the open air. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, then returned to Garrett, a silent question forming in their depths. "The agency assured me of your intentions, Mr. Holt," she began, her voice even, "and that you are a man of your word." Her tone was not accusatory, but rather a direct statement, a demand for transparency. "However, I detect an undercurrent. Am I to understand that I am not the sole focus of your current affairs?" Garrett felt a flush creep up his neck. Her perceptiveness was unnerving. He had intended to present a picture of a man moving on, a man ready for a new life, but her shrewd observation had already seen through the facade. He cleared his throat, buying time. "There was a visitor, an old acquaintance." He chose his words carefully, trying to sound dismissive. Clara's eyes, however, seemed to absorb every nuance of his hesitation. She connected the fresh tracks, the faint perfume, and Garrett's evasiveness. A slow, knowing smile, devoid of humor, touched her lips. "An acquaintance who has only just departed, I gather?" Her gaze swept across his face, reading the lingering resentment and the attempt at concealment. and one, perhaps, who views my arrival with some displeasure?" Garrett bristled. This was not how he'd imagined their first meeting. He'd expected deference, gratitude, perhaps even a touch of vulnerability. Instead, he was being interrogated by a woman who seemed to see right through him, a woman who had barely stepped off the stagecoach and already understood more than he wanted her to. Jedediah, having finished with the horses, approached, his eyes scanning Clara with his usual quiet assessment. He met her gaze, and for a moment, a silent understanding seemed to pass between them. He offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Garrett, feeling the weight of two sets of discerning eyes on him, knew he couldn't simply dismiss her. This woman was no pawn. She was a force, and she had already challenged the carefully constructed narrative he had prepared. The game, he realized with a jolt, had just changed. "So, this is it, then?" Clara's low voice cut through the stillness, a shocking crack in the quiet afternoon. The last whisper of a breeze died, leaving the air heavy with unspoken tension. She gestured vaguely at the letter Garrett still clutched, its crisp edges a jarring counterpoint to the unraveling scene. "The elaborate scheme to mend your broken ego." Garrett winced, the words finding a raw nerve he'd meticulously tried to anesthetize. He jammed the letter into his pocket, his jaw tightening. "My ego is none of your concern, Mrs. West. You are here because you answered an advertisement for a wife. That is the sum total of your concern." He strove to infuse his tone with authority, to reclaim the control that felt as if it were sifting through his grasp. Clara's laugh was a quick, humorless bark. "A wife? Or a prop?" "Let's not mince words, Mr. Holt. I saw the faint ghost of a picture frame on your mantel. I smelled the persistent scent of lilac from the bedroom, a fragrance definitively not my own. And I sensed the profound chill of a man still tethered to a specter, attempting to replace her with the nearest available body." Her gaze, unyielding, bored into his carefully constructed composure. "You wanted a pliable woman, didn't you? Someone who wouldn't pry. Someone who would simply slot into your existence and play her role in your petty vendetta." Garrett's face flushed. He advanced a step, his voice a low snarl. "You know nothing of my life or my intentions. You are overstepping, woman." The final word was intended as a dismissal, a sharp reminder of her supposed station. But Clara didn't waver. She met his ire with a cool inner flame. "Oh, but I know enough. I know that for a man to go to such lengths, to lure a stranger across the country under false pretenses, there must be a considerable wound. And I know I refuse to be a mere salve for your bitterness." She crossed her arms, an emblem of defiant grace. "I came here seeking a fresh start, a genuine partnership, not to be a pawn in your game of emotional retribution." The accusation hung heavy, a palpable weight between them. Garrett felt a surge of fury mixed with a grudging flicker of admiration for her sheer audacity. No one had ever dared to speak to him like this, least of all a woman he had paid to become his wife. "You signed the agreement, Mrs. West. You are bound by it." He felt a desperate need to invoke the legalities, to drag her back into the defined roles he had envisioned. "An agreement based on your deception, Mr. Holt," she retorted, her voice rising slightly. You failed to disclose the true nature of your motives. You presented the image of a man seeking companionship, not a man seeking vengeance. Had I known, I assure you, my signature would never have graced that paper. She paused, her eyes narrowing. So, what now? Do you intend to coerce me into playing the devoted wife while you languish for your lost love? Do you expect me to sit idly by while you plot to wound the woman who hurt you? Garrett ran a hand through his hair, frustration coiling tight in his gut. Her intelligence, her rapid wit, and her sheer refusal to be cowed were utterly disarming. He had anticipated a quiet, amenable woman, easily shaped to his purpose. Instead, a force of nature stood before him, poised to dismantle his meticulously built walls. I expect you to uphold your end of the bargain, he said, his voice clipped. And I expect you to remember your place. Clara let out another short, incredulous laugh. My place? My place is not to be some convenient stand-in, Mr. Holt. My place is where I choose to make it, and that choice will be founded on honesty and mutual respect, neither of which you've offered thus far. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. Let me be clear. I am not afraid of you, nor am I afraid to walk away. But if I am to stay, if we are to even contemplate this arrangement, then you will speak to me truthfully. You will treat me as an equal, not as a possession. And you will understand that I will not be used. The air crackled between them, thick with challenge and defiance. Garrett stared at her, a strange mix of fury and something akin to awe swirling within him. He had sought a balm, but he had found a firestorm. This was not the docile bride he had ordered. This was a battle he hadn't anticipated, and a woman who refused to be underestimated. The quiet, carefully constructed life he had envisioned was already in ruins, shattered by the sharp edges of Clara West's will. And as he looked at her, he knew, with a certainty that both chilled and thrilled him, that this was just the beginning. The aroma of pine and damp earth clung to Vivian as she surveyed the ranch yard, a delicate lace handkerchief held to her nose. Her gaze, sharp as a hawk's, impaled Clara. My dear, that dress, it's rather utilitarian, isn't it? I recall Garrett always had a distinct partiality for finer silks. Her voice, a silken whisper, carried a concealed thorn. Clara, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand, merely offered a serene smile. Practicality possesses its own distinct charm, Vivian, especially when one is mucking out stables. She hoisted a full bucket of feed, her movements fluid and robust. Vivian's perfectly sculpted brow arched. Mucking? You actually muck? I always envisioned a mail-order bride as more decorative. Her eyes flitted toward Garrett, who stood by the corral, feigning inspection of a fence post, but clearly attentive. Ornamental things tend to be fragile, Clara countered, her smile unwavering. She tossed the feed into a trough, and the horses whickered contentedly. Jedediah, observing from the barn entrance, grunted, a sound that could have signified either accord or amusement. Garrett watched Clara's effortless command of the animals, a flicker of surprise piercing his habitual stoicism. He'd anticipated her as decorative, yes, but also delicate, a hothouse flower to be admired. Instead, she moved with an inherent strength, her hands competent, her eyes keenly perceptive. The way she handled the reins, the way she soothed a skittish mare, it was all surprisingly adroit. He found himself grudgingly impressed. Vivian, however, remained unimpressed. She shadowed Clara, her whispers growing increasingly sharp. "You know, Garrett mentioned you hailed from a town. Not precisely accustomed to this rugged existence, are we? Perhaps he needs someone to remind him of life's refinements, not drag him deeper into the grit." Clara paused, her gaze meeting Vivian's. There was no anger, only a calm assessment. Perhaps Garrett understands precisely what he requires, and perhaps, Vivian, what he requires isn't dictated by silks or societal expectations. She returned to her tasks, leaving Vivian to simmer in her elegant vexation. Later that afternoon, as Clara expertly repaired a broken bridle in the tack room, Jedediah leaned against the doorframe, idly chewing a piece of straw. "You possess a useful hand, Miss West," he observed, his voice gruff but devoid of malice. "Most folks nowadays wouldn't differentiate a cinch from a stirrup." Clara looked up, a smudge of grease marring her cheek. "I believe in acquiring essential skills, Jedediah, and there's always something new to absorb out here." Her eyes, however, frequently drifted to Garrett. She perceived the tension etched around his mouth, the way his jaw would clench whenever Vivian's name arose, even indirectly. She saw the bitterness, a raw, festering wound that had yet to mend. It wasn't solely about his ex-fiancée. It encompassed the betrayal, the humiliation, the perceived erosion of control. He wore his resentment like a familiar garment, rendering him brittle and withdrawn. She watched him ride, his posture rigid, his gaze distant. He handled the horse with practiced ease, but a joylessness permeated his movements, a mechanical precision born of rote rather than passion. She knew his thirst for revenge had been the impetus for her arrival, but she was beginning to grasp that the revenge was a secondary objective, a misguided attempt to reclaim something that was never truly lost, his inherent self-worth. Vivian, meanwhile, persisted with her subtle campaign. She'd conjure old memories, shared jests, artfully insinuate herself into conversations, always managing to cast Clara as an interloper. "Garrett, do you recall that summer at Lake Tahoe, the one where we nearly capsized the canoe?" Her laughter tinkled, a sound crafted for exclusion. Garrett would offer a non-committal grunt or a curt, "I remember," his eyes often straying to Clara, who always appeared busy, yet always seemed to be listening. He found himself bristling at Vivian's veiled barbs, not just on Clara's behalf, but because they rekindled memories of the man he'd been, the man he was striving to forget. He was still battling to prove something, but with Clara's presence, the target of his validation was shifting, slowly but surely, from Vivian to himself. Clara, in turn, observed Garrett's internal skirmish. She noted the flicker of annoyance when Vivian spoke, the way his eyes would momentarily seek her out, as if for affirmation, or perhaps simply a shared understanding of the absurdity. He was a man suspended between two realms, the past he couldn't release, and the future he was still hesitant to embrace. And she, Clara, was an unwelcome yet undeniable component of that future.
Whispers of sabotage. The sun, usually a benevolent golden eye over the Bar M, now felt like a baleful glare. Garrett stood beside Jed, surveying the damage.
100 yards of sturdy barbed wire fence lay mangled, strands twisted into grotesque snarls like discarded fishing line. Beyond the breach, the dust-choked pasture told the tale. The faint, scattered tracks of 24 cattle, their hooves churning the earth as they fled. "Cut clean through," Jed grunted, nudging a snapped wire with the toe of his boot. "Not a break from an animal. Too precise." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, the frustration a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. Someone did this on purpose. His gaze, sharp and cold, swept towards the distant rise where the main house sat. Vivian, no doubt, was still inside, sipping tea, entirely oblivious to the chaos unfolding on his land. Or so she would pretend. "Happened sometime last night," Jed continued, oblivious to Garrett's internal battle. "Must have spooked 'em good to get 'em running like that. They'll be scattered all over the lower fields." Retrieving the cattle would be a day-long ordeal, an expensive diversion from the calving season that was already stretching his men thin. This wasn't just mischief, it was sabotage, and Garrett knew exactly who held a grudge deep enough to orchestrate such a thing. Later that afternoon, as the hands rode out to round up the errant cattle, Clara walked the perimeter of the damaged fence. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. She knelt, examining the clean cuts, the way the wire had been deliberately severed. Her fingers traced the rough edges. Then she stood, scanning the ground for any discarded tools, any telltale boot prints. There were none, only the trampled grass where the cattle had bolted. Garrett watched her from the porch, a curious mix of annoyance and grudging respect swirling within him. She wasn't wringing her hands or demanding explanations. She was investigating. He hadn't asked her to. He hadn't expected her to. That evening, a different kind of accident occurred. A bucket of feed, left precariously balanced on a high shelf in the stables, tumbled, narrowly missing one of the stable hands. The heavy wooden bucket splintered on the packed earth, sending oats scattering. "Just clumsy, I reckon," the young hand mumbled, shaken. But Clara, who had been in the stable checking on a mare, noticed the faint, almost invisible scratch marks on the shelf's edge, as if something had been dragged. She also noted the way the rope holding the bucket had been tied, a slip knot, easily undone with a slight jostle, not the usual secure hitch the stable hands employed. Garrett, alerted by the commotion, arrived to find Clara picking up splintered wood. "Another accident, it seems," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone is growing bolder." The following morning, the ranch's prized breeding stallion, Thunder, was found with a deep, fresh gash on his flank. Panic flared through the Bar M. Thunder was invaluable, his bloodline the foundation of Garrett's herd. The wound, though not life-threatening, was severe enough to require immediate veterinary attention and would likely keep him out of stud for weeks. Jedediah, his face grim, examined the splintered rail of Thunder's stall. "Looks like he spooked and caught himself, but—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing as he looked at a small, almost imperceptible groove in the wood, a fresh mark that hadn't been there before. Garrett's fury was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. This wasn't about cattle or feed. This was about crippling him,
about destroying his livelihood.
He paced the stable, his jaw tight. Vivian, he muttered, the name a curse. It has to be her. Clara, who had been meticulously cleaning the stallion's wound with a damp cloth, paused. "Do you have proof, Garrett?" Her voice was calm, steady, cutting through his rage. He stopped, turning to face her. Who else? Who else wants to see me ruined?" She straightened, her gaze unwavering. "Suspicion is not proof, and without proof you are merely guessing. A guess, however strong, is easily dismissed by someone as cunning as Vivian." She gestured towards the injured stallion. "This is escalating. These aren't random occurrences. Someone is actively trying to undermine you, Garrett, and they are becoming increasingly reckless." Garrett looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face was smudged with dust and a faint streak of blood, her sleeves rolled up, revealing capable forearms. She wasn't just talking, she was acting. While he was consumed by anger and suspicion, she was quietly, methodically gathering information. A new kind of respect, reluctant but undeniable, began to solidify within him. The woman he'd bought to spite another was proving to be an unexpected ally, perhaps even his most vital one. Unmasking the deceiver. The scent of pine tar and liniment still clung to Garrett, a constant reminder of Thunder's slow recovery. He found Clara in the tack room, meticulously polishing a bridle. The air was thick with the earthy smell of leather and saddle soap. She turned, a small, worn, leather-bound journal in her hand. "Garrett, we need to talk." Her voice was calm, but a subtle tremor in her fingers betrayed her seriousness. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "About what, Clara? More missing feed? Another broken fence?" He tried to inject a note of weariness into his voice, but a part of him dreaded her next words. She ignored his sarcasm, her gaze unwavering. "About Vivian, and the truth behind these accidents." She placed the journal on a nearby workbench, then fumbled in her pocket, producing a small, tarnished silver locket. "This was caught in the fence line, where the first break occurred. It's a cheap trinket, easily overlooked. But inside," she flipped it open to reveal a miniature, faded photograph, "is Vivian and another man, taken years ago. A keepsake." Garrett scoffed, pushing off the door frame. "Vivian would never wear something so common. She has an eye for expensive things, always has." The denial was automatic, a reflex born of years spent idealizing the woman who'd once held his heart. Clara's lips thinned. "Perhaps not now, but the picture clearly shows her much younger. And this," she pointed to a barely visible inscription on the locket's reverse, "is a single stylized V. Coincidence? Perhaps. But then there's this." She opened the journal. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing dates, times, and observations. "I found this tucked under the loose floorboard in the old bunkhouse, the one Vivian used to frequent when she visited. It's a daily log, Garrett, not just any log, but a record of every movement on your ranch, every animal count, every chore undertaken by your men. It starts weeks ago, before I even arrived." Garrett's brow furrowed. "Vivian was always organized, but what would she need with this?"
He walked closer, peering at the cramped script. He recognized some of the details, the specific feeding schedule for the herd, the rotation of the hands. "More than that," Clara continued, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. "It details the weaknesses. The gate latch that sticks, the section of fence that's been patched too many times, the days when only one ranch hand is on duty. And here," she tapped a specific entry, "the precise time Thunder was left alone in the south paddock.
The very day he was injured." A cold dread began to seep into Garrett's bones. He stared at the meticulous notes, the damning specificity. She couldn't. The words felt hollow, even to him. Clara looked at him, her eyes dark with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Garrett, she did. This isn't just a random act of malice. This is calculated, deliberate. Every accident aligns with an entry in this journal. The cut fences, the stampede, the poisoned feed, Thunder's injury. She knew exactly when and where to strike to cause maximum damage." She paused, then added, her voice softening slightly, "And to hurt you the most." He snatched the journal, flipping through the pages, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized a familiar flourish of Vivian's handwriting in the margins. It was undeniable. The carefully catalogued weaknesses, the almost gleeful notations next to incidents that had nearly crippled his ranch. His chest tightened, a familiar ache of betrayal twisting with a new, bitter anger. "No," he mumbled, shaking his head. "She loved this ranch. She loved me." The words tasted like ash. Clara stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. "She loved what she thought you could give her, Garrett. This isn't about love. It's about control, about revenge for something you didn't even know you'd done. She wants you broken, destitute, so she can sweep in and save you, or simply watch you crumble." Her grip tightened, her voice low and urgent. "You have to see it, Garrett. She's not just a woman scorned. She's dangerous, and she won't stop until she's taken everything from you." The truth, stark and brutal, slammed into him. The evidence was irrefutable. Vivian, the woman he'd longed for, the phantom of his past, was not a wounded ex-lover. She was a saboteur, a schemer, systematically dismantling his life. His pride, his lingering affection, shattered under the weight of Clara's irrefutable proof. A cold fury, unlike anything he'd ever known, began to simmer beneath his skin. A moment of peril. The oppressive silence in the study, heavy with the weight of Vivian's malice, was shattered by a distant, splintering crash from the direction of the south pasture. Garrett's head snapped up, his jaw tightening. Clara, who had been meticulously outlining the next steps for securing the ranch's perimeter, dropped the journal on the desk. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning dread. Before Garrett could fully process the sound, a desperate whinny tore through the air, followed by Jedediah's guttural shout. Garrett didn't hesitate. He burst from the study, Clara a swift shadow at his heels. They raced across the yard, the thud of their boots on the packed earth echoing the frantic beat of Garrett's heart. As they rounded the stables, the scene that unfolded stole the breath from Garrett's lungs. A section of the south pasture fence, inexplicably weakened, had collapsed. A gap yawned, gaping and dangerous, where solid timber had been moments before. And in that gap, tangled in a snarl of broken posts and barbed wire, was a young mare thrashing wildly. Jedediah, his face grim, was trying to calm the panicked animal. But it wasn't Jedediah's struggle that sent a cold spike of terror through Garrett. Clara was already there, closer than he realized, her hands outstretched, attempting to soothe the terrified mare. She moved with an innate grace, her voice a low, steady murmur, despite the clear and present danger. The mare, frantic with pain and fear, reared suddenly, its hooves flailing. A jagged splinter of wood, propelled by the force of the animal's struggle, flew directly towards Clara. Time seemed to distort. Garrett saw it all in excruciating slow motion. The sharp projectile hurtling through the air, Clara's head turned towards the horse, her body unknowingly in its path. A guttural cry ripped from his throat, a sound he didn't recognize as his own. "Clara, no!" He launched himself forward, a desperate, visceral instinct propelling him. He hit her with a jarring force, knocking her violently to the side, away from the deadly trajectory of the wood. They tumbled to the ground in a heap, the impact stinging. The splinter, missing Clara by mere inches, embedded itself with a sickening thud into the earth where her head had been moments before. Garrett scrambled up, pulling Clara with him, his hands gripping her shoulders, searching for any sign of injury. His gaze swept over her face, her arms, her legs, his breath catching in his throat. Her eyes, wide and startled, met his. She was pale, a little breathless, but unharmed. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, laced with a raw urgency that surprised even him. The casual indifference he'd cultivated around her, the emotional distance he'd meticulously maintained, had evaporated in an instant. All that remained was a stark, terrifying realization. The thought of her being harmed, truly harmed, had ripped through him like a physical blow. Clara nodded slowly, her hand instinctively going to her chest. "Yes, I think so. You pushed me." Jedediah, having finally managed to subdue the mare enough to free its leg, hobbled over, his face etched with concern. "What in tarnation just happened here? Clara, you all right?" Garrett didn't even look at Jedediah. His eyes were still fixed on Clara, a tempest of emotions raging within him. Fear, primal and potent, still thrummed in his veins, but beneath it, a new, unsettling sensation stirred. A fierce, protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed, certainly not for anyone since before Vivian. It was a feeling that transcended revenge, transcended expectation, transcended the carefully constructed walls around his heart. It was, undeniably, a feeling of deep, profound care. He finally tore his gaze from Clara, turning to Jedediah, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Jed, get that fence secured, immediately. And then I want you to check every single section of fencing on this ranch, every post, every wire. I want to know how this happened." Jedediah, sensing the shift in Garrett, the simmering fury and the uncharacteristic vulnerability, simply nodded. "Consider it done, boss." Garrett then turned back to Clara, the intensity in his eyes unwavering. He took her arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and steered her away from the chaotic scene. They walked in silence back towards the house, the sun now dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows. The air was cool, but a tremor still ran through Garrett's limbs. Once inside the study, the locket and journal still lying open on the desk, Garrett turned to her. His usual guarded expression was gone, replaced by a raw honesty she hadn't seen before. "She's not just playing games, is she?" he said, his voice barely a whisper, the previous denial completely stripped away. This wasn't just an accident, not with everything else. She meant to hurt someone. Clara met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "I believe she did, Garrett. This fits the pattern. The methodical weakening, the opportune moment. It's all here." She gestured to the open journal, its pages filled with Vivian's meticulous, vindictive scrawls. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping slightly. The facade of control, the delusion of a calculated revenge, had crumbled. "I should have listened to you sooner," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was so blinded by my own foolishness." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost unbearable. "Thank you, Clara, for seeing what I couldn't, for saving me from myself." The gratitude, raw and genuine, hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built on the precipice of peril. He had finally listened. He had finally trusted. And in that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them. The dawn broke with a chill that seeped into the bones, but Garrett felt a new fire in his gut. The nearly disastrous incident with the mare had stripped away the last vestiges of his denial, leaving behind a raw resolve. "We need to secure this place, Clara," he stated, his voice devoid of its usual clipped edge. He unrolled a worn blueprint of the ranch across the kitchen table, its edges curling. "Vivian knows our weak spots. We can't give her another opening." Clara leaned in, her gaze tracing the lines of the diagram. "Perimeter fences first," she suggested, her finger tapping a section of the western boundary. She hit the south pasture, likely testing our response time. "Then we need to consider access points, gates, secondary roads." Her analytical mind, once a source of irritation, now felt like a welcome compliment to his own practicality. They spent the morning on horseback, riding the vast perimeter. Garrett pointed out crumbling sections, areas where dense brush offered cover, and forgotten paths. Clara, surprisingly adept in the saddle, made mental notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. When they stopped for a lunch of jerky and dried fruit, she pulled out a small notepad. "I've outlined a plan. We reinforce the entire south and west lines with new posts and heavier gauge wire. Jed and I can start on the south while you organize materials for the west." His initial impulse to argue, to reassert his authority, died on his tongue. Her plan was sound, efficient, and proactive. "All right," he conceded, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. "You really are something, Clara West." A blush bloomed on her cheeks, but she met his gaze without flinching. "And you, Garrett Holt, are finally seeing clearly." Over the next few days, the ranch transformed. The rhythmic thud of hammer on wood, the clang of wire stretching taut, and the low rumble of Jed's truck became the soundtrack of their unity. Garrett found himself working alongside Clara more often than not. He'd dig the post holes, his muscles straining, while she'd carefully measure the wire,
her movements precise.
He even caught himself laughing when she struggled to untangle a particularly stubborn coil, her frustration a charming contrast to her usual composure. He watched the sunlight catch the strands of her hair as she bent to her task, a surprising warmth spreading through him. One afternoon, as they were stringing new wire along the northern fence line, a rogue gust of wind tore Clara's wide-brimmed hat from her head, sending it tumbling into a muddy ditch. She groaned, looking at the soiled felt with dismay. Garrett, without a word, waded into the muck, retrieving it with a grin. He then playfully placed it on his own head, striking a pose. Clara burst into laughter, a clear, bell-like sound that resonated through the quiet fields. "It suits you, rancher," she teased, wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek with her thumb. The simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, a current of awareness that was both startling and exhilarating. Later, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, the silence between them was no longer strained. It was comfortable, companionable. Jed sat a few feet away, whittling a piece of wood, his presence a quiet anchor. "It feels good to be doing something," Garrett confessed, breaking the spell. "Not just reacting, but taking control." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Control is a powerful thing, but true strength lies in knowing when to share it." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the last light of day, soft and knowing. "We make a good team, Garrett." He felt a tightening in his chest, a strange mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper. The animosity that had defined their initial interactions had melted away, replaced by a nascent respect, a shared purpose, and an undeniable undercurrent of attraction. He found himself wanting to reach out, to brush a stray curl from her face, to bridge the small distance between them. The thought was both terrifying and utterly compelling. He'd ordered a pawn for revenge. He was slowly falling for a partner. The ultimate betrayal. The late afternoon sun, usually a comforting presence, now cast long, menacing shadows across the Bar M, mirroring the gloom settling over Garrett. He stood on the porch, a fresh letter from the matrimonial agency crumpled in his hand, a tangible reminder of his ill-conceived plan. The previous night's near disaster with the mare, the subsequent fortification of the ranch, and Clara's unexpected competence had finally shattered his denial. Vivian was no longer a ghost of the past. She was a clear and present danger, actively working to dismantle his life. The crunch of gravel announced an arrival, and Garrett's stomach tightened. A sleek, dark carriage pulled by two perfectly matched bays rolled into the yard, coming to a halt with a flourish. Vivian Thorne, a vision in a tailored emerald riding habit, descended with practiced grace. Her eyes, usually sparkling with an almost predatory glint, held a new, chilling resolve. Clara emerged from the house, her expression unreadable, and positioned herself beside Garrett. The unspoken solidarity was a balm, yet it did little to quell the rising tide of dread in Garrett's chest. Vivian didn't bother with pleasantries. Her gaze swept over the fortified perimeter, the fresh fencing, and then landed on Clara, a flicker of something akin to amusement dancing in her eyes. "Playing house, Garrett?" she purred, her voice a silken thread of malice. "It's a charming tableau, but ultimately
quite futile." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Get to the point, Vivian." She smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "The point, my dear Garrett, is that you've been living on borrowed time." She reached into her reticule and produced a thick, official-looking envelope. "I've come to claim what's mine." A knot of ice formed in Garrett's gut. "What are you talking about?" Vivian unfolded a document, its legal jargon a blur of incomprehensible threats. "After your regrettable decision to break our engagement, I discovered certain irregularities in your father's will. It seems, Garrett, that the Bar M was never truly yours."
Not entirely, at least. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but it carried clearly in the sudden, oppressive silence. My family always had a stake, a silent partnership, if you will, a debt owed, long overdue. And with these corrected documents, she tapped the paper with a manicured finger, I am now the sole legal proprietor of the Bar M. The world tilted. Garrett felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and hollow. Forged documents, a silent partnership, his father's will. It was an elaborate, cruel deception, meticulously planned and executed with devastating precision. This wasn't about revenge for a broken engagement. This was about absolute destruction. The Bar M, his legacy, his identity, was being ripped away from him, not by a storm or a drought, but by the woman he had once loved. He swayed, the sturdy porch railing the only thing keeping him upright. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just betrayal, it was an annihilation. Everything he had fought for, every drop of sweat, every calloused hand, every sleepless night spent worrying over the herd, was rendered meaningless. He was utterly, completely vulnerable, stripped bare. Clara, however, remained rooted, her gaze fixed on Vivian, an almost predatory glint in her own eyes. "Forged documents," she stated, her voice quiet but firm. "That's a serious accusation, Vivian, one that carries severe legal consequences." Vivian merely laughed, a brittle, joyless sound. "Proof is in the pudding, my dear. These documents have been officially authenticated. You're welcome to try and fight it, of course, but it will be a costly and ultimately futile endeavor. The Bar M is mine. And you," she swept her gaze over Garrett, now slumped against the railing, "are nothing." The sting of her words, sharper than any whip, brought a spark of desperate defiance back to Garrett. He pushed away from the railing, his fists clenching at his sides. "You won't get away with this, Vivian," he rasped, his voice raw with fury and despair. "Oh, but I already have," she countered, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. She turned, a final, disdainful glance at the two of them, and climbed back into her carriage. With a crack of the whip, the driver turned the horses, and Vivian Thorne, the thief of his future, rode away, leaving Garrett adrift in a sea of despair. Clara's hand found his arm, her touch grounding. "She's bluffing," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm raging within him. "Or at least, she's trying to make us believe she has an airtight case. But forged documents can be disproven. There are always inconsistencies, paper trails, expert analyses." Garrett stared at her, a flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, beginning to ignite in the desolate landscape of his heart. "What do we do?" he whispered, the words barely audible. Clara's grip tightened. "We fight back. We find the real documents. We expose her for the fraud she is. This isn't over, Garrett, not by a long shot." Her eyes, usually so perceptive, now blazed with an unyielding determination. "We start by finding a lawyer, one who isn't afraid to dig." The race against time. The scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun filled the ranch office as Clara meticulously unfurled another brittle parchment. Days had blurred into a relentless cycle of reading and rereading, her fingers stained with ink from ancient ledgers. Garrett, a silent sentinel, hovered nearby, his usual restlessness subdued by a grim determination. Jedediah, ever practical, kept the coffee pot brewing, its aroma a constant, comforting presence amidst the mounting anxiety. "Garrett," Clara's voice cut through the quiet, sharper than usual. She tapped a finger on a faint, almost illegible passage in a deed dated 1888. "Look at this. Provided that the land shall remain under the direct management and cultivation of a lineal descendant of Elias Holt, or said land shall revert to the Holt Estate Trust to be overseen by the county probate court for distribution among living heirs." Garrett leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "The Holt Estate Trust? What in God's name is that?" "It means if you aren't running this ranch, Garrett," Clara explained, her eyes bright with a sudden fierce energy, "Vivian can't just waltz in and claim it. She's not a Holt." The land would go into this trust, not directly to her. A spark ignited in Garrett's eyes, a flicker of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Vivian's arrival. "So she can't just take it?" "Not outright," Clara confirmed, a triumphant glint in her gaze. "But we need to prove that you are a lineal descendant, which is obvious, and that you've been actively managing and cultivating the land. And we need to act fast. She'll move quickly once she realizes her forged documents aren't enough to secure complete ownership." The discovery propelled them into a whirlwind of activity. The ranch office transformed into a command center. Clara, armed with the rediscovered claws, began outlining a legal strategy, her mind a swift, intricate machine. Garrett, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, rode across the ranch, gathering old hands, neighbors, and anyone who could attest to his continuous management of the Bar M. Jedediah, meanwhile, became their invaluable scout, tracking down old county records, birth certificates, and obscure legal documents that might further strengthen their case. The clock became their relentless adversary. The sun rose and set with an alarming speed, each day bringing them closer to the impending court date Vivian had so smugly announced. Meals were snatched between frantic searches and detailed discussions. Sleep became a luxury, often replaced by the glow of a lantern late into the night, casting long, dancing shadows of their determination across the walls. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, mirroring the tempest in their lives, Garrett found Clara slumped over a ledger, her head resting on her arms. He gently placed a cup of warm coffee beside her. "You should rest, Clara," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She stirred, pushing herself upright, her eyes still heavy-lidded but focused. "No time, Garrett. We're still missing a clear record of the Trust's current administration. Without it, the clause is just words on paper. He watched her, a profound admiration blooming in his chest. This woman, whom he had sought to use as a pawn, was now his fiercest ally, his beacon in the encroaching darkness. Her unwavering resolve, her sharp intellect, her sheer tenacity, it all chipped away at the hardened shell around his heart. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the glass. The air thrummed with a nervous energy, a palpable tension. They were close, agonizingly close, but the final piece of the puzzle remained elusive. The deadline loomed, a dark, inescapable shadow, and the race against time felt increasingly desperate. Justice on the Bar M. The oppressive heat of the late morning sun beat down on the Bar M ranch, mirroring the tension thrumming in the air. A small crowd had gathered, an unusual sight for a Monday. Ranch hands stood in a hushed semicircle, their gazes shifting between the porch and the sleek black carriage that had just pulled up, its polished wheels kicking up dust. From within, Vivian Thorne emerged, a triumphant smile painted on her lips, her eyes like chips of ice as they swept over Garrett and Clara, who stood side by side on the porch. Jedediah, his face a granite mask, stood a respectful distance behind them, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. Vivian, resplendent in a tailored traveling suit, ascended the porch steps as if she owned them, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the wood. "Well, Garrett," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension, "it seems my patience has finally paid off. The Bar M is mine, as of this morning's court order." She held up a document, its official seal glinting in the sunlight. The judge was quite clear. No lineal descendant actively managing the property, no ownership. A simple matter, really. Garrett's jaw was tight, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He met Vivian's gaze squarely, his hand subtly brushing against Clara's back. Clara stood tall, her presence a quiet defiance next to him, her expression calm but alert, like a hawk surveying its prey. "Not so simple, Vivian," Clara interjected, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the heavy silence. "There was a small detail you overlooked in your haste." Vivian's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "And what precisely would that be, dear Clara? Another one of your fantastical theories?" She glanced at Garrett, a mocking curl to her lip. "Still letting your mail-order bride do your talking, Garrett? Some things never change." Garrett stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "The Bar M has been under continuous management by a lineal descendant, Vivian. Namely, me." Vivian laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Prove it." "Your financial records are a mess. Your ranch is in shambles. You've barely kept it afloat since your father passed." "On the contrary," Clara said, her eyes fixed on Vivian. "While Mr. Holt's personal finances may have seen fluctuations, the ranch itself has been meticulously managed, and we have irrefutable proof." She nodded to Jedediah, who stepped forward, holding a thick ledger. "These here are the Bar M's books," Jedediah stated, his voice gravelly. "Every dime in, every dime out. Signed, dated, and witnessed by me since Mr. Holt's daddy passed. All ranch expenses, ranch income, separated clear as day from personal accounts." He held the ledger open, revealing pages filled with neat script and columns of figures. Every head of cattle, every bale of hay, every repair to every fence post accounted for, and every one of 'em signed off by Garrett Holt himself. Vivian's face began to pale. That's impossible. My lawyers assured me there was no such documentation. Perhaps your lawyers weren't looking hard enough, or in the right places, Clara suggested, a hint of steel in her tone. And perhaps, she continued, her gaze unwavering, they weren't aware of the Holt Estate Trust's specific stipulations regarding the lineal descendant clause. A clause which, by the way, explicitly states that the ranch's management, not the individual's personal prosperity, is the defining factor. Garrett then produced a second document, its edges crisp. This is a notarized affidavit from Mr. Elijah Harding, the current administrator of the Holt Estate Trust. He confirms the continuous and diligent management of the Bar M by me, Garrett Holt, for the past 15 years. He also states that the trust explicitly prohibits any transfer of ownership if the lineal descendant clause is met. And, Garrett added, a triumphant glint in his eye, he confirms that your forged documents were, in fact, exactly that. Forged. The color drained from Vivian's face, leaving it a sickly white. Her triumphant posture crumbled. The small crowd of ranch hands stirred, a murmur of vindication rippling through them. Vivian's gaze darted around, searching for an escape, but found none. Her grand scheme, her calculated revenge, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. "This is a lie!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "A fabrication! You're trying to trick me!" "The judge will decide that, Vivian," Garrett said, his voice calm, but with an underlying current of finality. "But I believe Mr. Harding's testimony, combined with Jedediah's meticulous records and the sheer weight of your deceit, will make his decision quite clear." He gestured toward the carriage. "I believe your business here is concluded." Humiliation washed over Vivian's face. Her eyes, once so full of malicious glee, now burned with impotent rage. With a strangled cry of frustration, she spun on her heel, her expensive skirt swishing around her. She practically stumbled into her carriage, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the glass. The driver, sensing the shift in the wind, quickly snapped the reins, and the carriage jolted forward, disappearing in a cloud of dust. A collective sigh of relief swept through the assembled ranch hands. Jedediah clapped Garrett heartily on the shoulder, a rare, genuine smile creasing his weathered face. Garrett turned to Clara, a profound gratitude shining in his eyes. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent testament to the partnership they had forged, a testament to the fact that, together, they had saved the Bar M. The sun, no longer a source of oppressive heat, now seemed to warm them, a promise of a new beginning, a future forged in trust. The dust, stirred by Vivian's hasty departure, had long settled, but a different kind of quiet now enveloped the Bar M. The air, usually thick with the sounds of ranch life, felt hushed, expectant. Garrett stood on the wide porch, the setting sun painting long shadows across the yard. In his hand, he held a crumpled letter, its official-looking header from the matrimonial agency a stark reminder of the man he'd been just months ago, the man who'd seen Clara as a tool, a means to an end. He found Clara in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning the already spotless counters. The scent of pine cleaner mingled with the faint aroma of the coffee she'd brewed earlier. She moved with an easy grace that had once irritated him, now simply captivated him. Her back was to him, her dark hair catching the warm glow from the window. Garrett cleared his throat, the sound a little rougher than he intended. Clara paused, her hand hovering over a dishcloth, and slowly turned. Her eyes, intelligent and knowing, met his, and he felt a familiar vulnerability bloom in his chest. This woman saw through him, always had. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." She simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and leaned back against the counter, her arms crossed. He took a deep breath, the confession he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his head, suddenly feeling inadequate. I owe you an apology for everything," he started, gesturing vaguely with the crumpled letter. "For bringing you here under false pretenses, for treating you like a chess piece in my bitter game, for not seeing you, truly seeing you, for the incredible woman you are, until it almost cost me everything." His gaze dropped to the floorboards, unable to hold her steady stare. "I was so consumed by the past, by Vivian, by a need for revenge, that I nearly destroyed the only good thing that's happened to me in years." He looked up again, his eyes pleading. "You came here, a stranger, and you fought for this ranch, for me, when I didn't even deserve it. You saw through my anger, my hurt, my damn foolish pride. You showed me what strength truly is, what loyalty means." He took a step closer, the letter forgotten in his hand. "And somewhere along the way, without me even realizing it, you became everything to me. My partner, my confidant, my conscience, my future." He dropped the letter, letting it fall to the floor with a soft rustle. "Clara, I love you. Not because of what you did for the ranch, not as a retaliation against Vivian, but because of who you are, your fierce spirit, your unwavering integrity, your remarkable mind. I love the way you challenge me, the way you make me see things differently. I love the way you laugh, the way you make this place feel like a home. I want to build a life with you, a real life, forged in trust and genuine affection, not on some foolish, broken promise, but on love." Clara's eyes had softened as he spoke, a glimmer of unshed tears making them shine. A small, tremulous smile touched her lips. She pushed herself off the counter and walked towards him, stopping just inches away. She reached out, her fingers gently cupping his jaw. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw the man beneath the anger, even when you tried to hide him. I saw the hurt, the potential for good. You were a complicated mess, yes," she chuckled softly, "but you were never truly beyond redemption. And you've changed, Garrett. I've watched you fight your demons, watched you choose the harder path, the right path. You've shown me a vulnerability I never expected, and a strength that makes me proud." Her thumb stroked his cheek, a warm, reassuring gesture. "I came here with my own hopes, my own dreams of a fresh start. I never imagined it would lead me to a man like you, a man who, despite his flaws, could inspire such respect, such love." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Yes, Garrett, I love you too, and I want to build that future with you. A real future. Here. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, feeling the solid comfort of her body against his. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel the soft flutter of her breath. The weight of years of bitterness and resentment seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of peace and belonging. Later, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, they stood together on the porch, his arm wrapped around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. The Bar M stretched out before them, silent and vast, the distant mountains fading into the twilight. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured, her voice content. "It's ours," Garrett corrected, tightening his hold. "Ours to build, ours to protect. Together." He felt her nod against him. "We'll make it thrive, Garrett. Not just the land, but everything. Our life here, our family, if that's what we choose." He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. The idea of a future, truly shared, truly chosen, felt like a revelation. The past, with all its thorns and shadows, was finally behind them. Before them lay a new beginning, a path forged in trust, paved with love, and stretching out into the limitless promise of the wide-open western sky.